So the first presentation today is from Jeane Nicolas. So Jeane is a senior toxicologist at MPI Food Safety, and she's involved with the Aotearoa Impacts and Mitigation of Microplastics project, which is funded by MPI. We look forward to Jeane's presentation on the impact on human health of microplastics in the New Zealand diet. So welcome, Jeane. If you could share your presentation now, please.
Thank you, Tim. I will share my screen.
Thank you.
How does this work? No.
Just in the bottom there of your screen, can you make it full presentation?
Yeah.
That's perfect. Thanks, Jeane. Go for it.
Can you see my first slide?
Sure can. Go for it.
Yeah, cool. So thanks for attending my presentation. This afternoon, I will talk about microplastics in the New Zealand diet. And first, I will explain a bit more on microplastics in general. Then I will quickly highlight international research, and then I will talk about food safety research in New Zealand. When you have microplastics, first of all, you have the primary microplastics and the secondary microplastics. Primary microplastics are basically manufactured in a certain size and shape to be added to certain products like personal care products or cleaning products. And the secondary microplastics are basically the degradation of the larger plastics, like your plastic bottle in a marine environment. When you look at the size of the particles, it's important to note that there's no definition on the size, but these values are generally used in the literature. So between 5 millimeter and 1 micron are microplastics, and below the 1 micron are generally nanoplastics. What do we know about the toxicity of microplastics? The EFSA concluded that there's a potential distribution for microplastics to distribute to secondary tissues, whereby then the smaller particles, the nanoplastics, they have the potential to distribute through the whole body. There is no toxicokinetic data available, so no data on metabolism or excretion of nanoplastics or microplastics, and there's very limited toxicity data available. More recently, more toxicity studies are done, but I have to say they're of no use at the moment because they use very high doses, like extreme high dose levels, and they're really not relevant to the environmental exposure. Other studies looked at the inflammatory or immune response. Again, it's really important to take into account the dose they've used in the study. As you all know, there's the plastics are not just one compound. There can be polyethylene, polypropylene, but they also have additives when they get manufactured. When they are in the environment or in the marine environment, for example, they also can take up certain environmental chemicals like heavy metals or persistent organic pollutants. And the aging and weathering of the particle will have an impact of the uptake rate. Additional to the environmental contaminants, you can also, the plastics also can absorb microbiological contaminants like Vibrio or Campylobacter. And there's data where it suggests that if these microbes attach to particles, they have a wider distribution and they're able to transport in a wider area. But also if you have multiple particles, high density of plastics together, they can create hotspots. There's also data out there suggesting that the fungal pathogens accumulate in the terrestrial ecosystem, and it's likely that viruses also attach to microplastics, but more data is needed to confirm that. So now we know you have all these different types of microplastics or nanoplastics, and you have all these types of environmental contaminations, but also additives or microbiological contaminants. So these cocktail of particles, what does it mean if we're exposed to it? And in this presentation, I will mainly focus on the oral exposure, but there's also a research question on the inhalation exposure. But what happens if we're exposed to it? And we just don't know. The bioavailability is really depending on a lot of parameters. For the plastics, it's the type of plastic, but size and the shape of the particle is a really important parameter. And there's just very limited data available on the bioavailability of microplastics after oral exposure. I have to say, if you look at the data out there at the moment, there's no evidence that we're having an elevated exposure to those environmental contaminants due to microplastics contamination. This is research that needs to be further taken. What do we know about microplastics in food? Internationally, there, and I've listed them here, microplastics have been detected in several food groups. And also I've listed here water to add it. But I have to say that not all studies are of similar qualities. It's really important if you determine how many particles are in your food group. It's also really important to identify the particles, because we really need to know, are they plastics or not, and what types of plastics. At the moment, it's really a limitation that we can't identify and detect the smaller microplastics and the nanoplastics. So basically, we can go up to down to 10 micron, and some maybe a bit lower, but that's basically it at the moment. So looking at microplastics in food, they can come from different sources. For example, if your water is contaminated and you in your beer production, then it will end up in your beer. But also it can come from the produce itself. We know shellfish are really good filter feeders, so they will get exposed to microplastics. But also there's data out there that plants may take up small particles. Although I have to say a lot more research is needed to explore that field. Of course, plastics can also come from your packaging, and I'm not saying ban all plastic packaging, but especially when you look at studies where they looked at, for example, opening a lid, or then it can release tiny particles. Another really important source in your food can come from air. We know it's the microplastics are everywhere. They're also in the air. They're in this office where I am. When I'm preparing my food in the kitchen or having at the dinner table, particles from the air will end up at my plate. There is a study from Catarino and co-authored in 2018 where they estimated that if you have a plate with green shell mussels, that the contamination of the air, the exposure from the air particles was higher than from the mussels itself. Looking at research overseas, like I said, there's detections in water, soil, air, and food. But again, there's the quality there's a wide range in quality and usability of those studies, because especially not all studies do not identify the polymers, and this is really an important step that we need to keep doing, because otherwise you do not know how much of your particles are plastics or not. It's a very important limitation is that there's no standard analytical method available. That means that different studies from different countries are done different ways, and they're not comparable, and it's really hard to share data and compare data. Again, the limitation in particle size is there, but other research groups are looking at finding methods to detect smaller particles. As said, there are some animal toxicity studies available, but not suitable to perform a hazard assessment. Yes, there's a lot of research going on on microplastics. I've just picked some that might be of interest. In Europe, they focus on, there's a group focusing on seafood. There's a consortium in the Netherlands looking at the human health effects of microplastics, and they will also look at immunotox, neurotox. In UN, they're developing guidelines and monitoring protocols, which is going to be really important. But also Health Canada looked at microplastics in drinking water, the EFSA, the US EPA, they all have different research programs ongoing. But every international conference or workshop, it is highlighted that it's really important that we're going to develop and improve and align our analytical methods so we can share data and compare data. And another important focus will be internationally to develop and align proper toxicity studies we can use for our hazard assessment. Now closer to home, we can, when we look at what we've done in New Zealand, New Zealand Food Safety, in cooperation with the ESR, published a risk profile in 2019. It's on our website. I'm happy to share the link. Basically identified several data gaps. And the main point I want to highlight, I will not read out all of them, but there's no data to determine the risk to microplastic or nanoplastic contamination after oral exposure. So, last year we started research on microplastics. on food and then the impact on human health. This research is funded by the MPI Operational Research Fund, and it's in cooperation with the ESR and the University of Canterbury. And we're going to look at, basically, there's 3 phases: a food survey, a bioavailability study, and the impact of microplastic contamination to the primary industries. With the food survey, different food groups have been included, and that they're based on popular foods like dietary intake, what people eat in New Zealand, but also important foods for New Zealand, like, for example, kiwi fruit. A separate group will look at wild food. That will be a separate group. And as I mentioned, there's no analytical method available. So the first focus was to detect and identify the microplastics without impacting the plastics. And this is how it's going to be done. So the first step, you have your digestion is basically extracting the particles from your food matrix. Then you're going to vacuum filter through, depending on how much you want. You can pick different kinds of micron filters, and then the detection and the confirmation. All these steps have their challenges, especially contamination through the different steps. But we're currently really focusing on the digestion method. Similar to conclusions overseas, it's really hard to digest the food part without impacting the plastic. If you use harsh acids or high temperatures, they will change the plastics or even remove them. So that's what we're currently working on. So we've completed several trials using enzymes and chemicals at low concentrations and using low temperatures below the 40 degrees. And as said, similar to overseas conclusions, it's not as easy as it looks. So we're, but I'm hopeful we'll get there. Then, once we know what's in our food and what types of plastic and contaminants, it's really important to know what happens once we consume it, and how much do we basically excrete and how much do we absorb and becomes available to the body, because that will be really important for the dose. So we're going to do an in vitro bioavailability study using cell lines, and we're going to determine the bioavailability of the microplastic, but also from the contaminants on those particles. Finally, an overview of the research on microplastics in New Zealand. As you can see, there are multiple research programs on the way, which is really good. And some look at marine environment, freshwater environment, in air. And in case you're interested in any of these projects, I can get you in contact with the contact person of this research program. Similar to the previous slide, here's the overview of the New Zealand publications on microplastics, and I'm happy to share this this list. Then, to summarize, there's a lot of research on microplastics. Every week there are multiple papers published, but they're not always usable because of the quality, but also how some are not usable because how they were performed. For example, there was a study looking at microplastics in fruit and veggies, and they identified multiple particles, but they didn't identify if it were plastics or not. So multiple media highlighted that our fruit and veggies were full of microplastics, but basically based on that study, it's that you can't say it because they didn't confirm how many particles were plastics or not. The development of an analytical method is not available, and as said, it's not as easy as it looks or we thought, but we're working on it. And the limitation will be that the detection of smaller particles is going to be not possible at this moment, but as said, hopefully groups are working on it and we can detect the smaller particles in the future. So finally, the take-home message is that the impact on the human health of microplastic contamination in food is unknown, but several groups are working on this to be able to assess the risk to microplastic exposure. I think I'm just in time. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jeane. Really excellent presentation. And yeah, we've got a bit of time for some questions now. We've got a couple have come through the chat function, so I'll just read those out to you, Jeane, so everybody can hear them.
Yep.
The first question is from Steve Holroyd. A really good question. Do you see the development of international standards for detection and identification of microplastics in foods as a priority?
Yeah. I think it's a main priority, but where to start? There's so many. This research is really new. The last EFSA conference, multiple people, we all agreed that it is really important. But the problem is you need all these different matrices. If I'm only looking at food, which is already complex. But then other people are looking at biosolids and sediments and water. Yeah, so yes, it's a high priority because otherwise, you can't share data. There are several, like I said, there are several studies in food and say, okay, we know this is in our diet. That's still impossible. And yeah, I think it's a standard would be, or more guidance and alignment is really important.
Mm. Thank you. There's another question from Karen Rogers asking about, has the ratio of fossil fuel versus bio-based plastics in food products been determined? And there's a supplementary question, are bioplastics becoming an environmental nuisance, or is it legacy fossil fuel plastics that are the issue?
Again, so the bio, can you please repeat the question?
Yes, so it's to do with whether the plastics that are being observed in food systems, are they traditionally fossil fuel based plastics, or are there more recent bio based plastics that are making their way into different products?
So first of all, there's not a lot of studies performed on plastics in food yet. And I said the studies that are done, not all of them are usable because they didn't identify the plastics. But I'm sure that the bioplastics will end up in our food as well at one point. But then again, as Kath was saying, it's really depending on how much and which types. But I haven't come across any papers. There's one paper looking at tea bags where they looked at the PLA, but that's the only one looking at it. And I'm happy to share that reference.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question here from Miriam Prickett. Do you think the plastics industry is or will push back on regulation and standards that limit plastics use?
That's, maybe I'm not the best expert to ask that, but I think it's also really important to keep in mind that we still do not know if we're exposed to microplastic at a harmful level. I'm not saying plastics are good or we should ban all plastics, but plastics are also really useful because, for example, and I'm not a packaging expert, but your chicken should be packaged really safely because you do not want any other food safety issues. But also, and this is not related to food, but you know, in the hospital, we still need plastic at a certain way. I think it's more the question on what do we really need? What types of plastic? Do we really need that straw we use once? And so that's a good question. Yeah, but that's not up to me. But yeah, maybe there's pushback, but also maybe it's important to look at what do we really need, because I think some plastic which we should keep, and that's more maybe a wider environmental issue on sustainability, and that's not my area of expertise.
Okay, thanks, Kath, and thanks for those questions that came through. So sorry, I mean, Jeane. Jeane, if you could unshare your screen now. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was clear around the issue and what work's been done in that space. So thank you very much.
How do I?